July 2026 became one of the most unusual months in the recent history of the death penalty in the United States. In this video, we'll take a look at every inmate executed during that month, including a historic double execution in Florida, where 2 death row prisoners were executed on the same day. We'll explore the crimes they committed, the events that led them to death row, their final hours, their last words, and the details of each execution. Dennis Sochor, executed on July 14, 2026, by lethal injection. Dennis Sochor's criminal life began at a very young age. On March 13, 1980, when he was only 28 years old, he kidnapped a woman whose name was never publicly released. He forced her to leave a cocktail lounge in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, made her get into a vehicle, and drove her to an isolated area. There, he took her to a trailer attached to a vehicle where he brutally sexually assaulted her. Despite the attack, the victim managed to escape and reported what had happened. Shortly afterward, she returned to the location accompanied by a police officer. Sochor was still inside the trailer, and he was immediately arrested. Months later, he was found guilty, and in September 1980, he was sentenced to 1 year in prison and 5 years of probation. However, sometime later, a court overturned that conviction, and Dennis Sochor regained his freedom. After leaving prison, he moved to the state of Michigan, where his brother Gary lived. Instead of changing his behavior, he soon committed another sexual assault against a woman. The attack led authorities to begin searching for him, and in order to avoid being arrested, Sochor fled back to Florida. On the night of December 31, 1981, New Year's Eve, Gary had traveled from Michigan just a few days earlier to spend the holidays with his brother. That night, the two men left their home in a vehicle with the intention of celebrating the arrival of the new year at the Banana Boat Lounge, a bar located in Broward County near Fort Lauderdale. Unbeknownst to them, that same night, 18-year-old Patricia Marie Gifford was also heading to the Banana Boat Lounge with her friend Delta Harville. Patricia and Delta arrived at the Banana Boat Lounge at around 9 p.m. While they were sitting at the bar, they were approached by 2 brothers, 29-year-old Dennis Sochor and Gary Sochor, who began flirting with them. For much of the night, the 4 of them talked and drank together. However, according to Delta's later testimony, both she and Patricia rejected the brothers' attempts to pursue them. Throughout the celebration, Delta took several photographs to remember that New Year's Eve. Without realizing it, one of those images would later become a key piece of evidence in the investigation. The photograph showed Patricia smiling while, just a few feet behind her, Dennis Sochor appeared, staring directly at her. At midnight, the 4 of them, along with the other customers inside the bar, celebrated the arrival of 1982. Several hours later, at around 2 a.m., Delta began feeling unwell. Although records showed that she had only consumed 1 drink, investigators suspected that she may have been drugged by the Sochor brothers. Patricia and the brothers helped her get to her vehicle, where she fell into a deep sleep. Afterward, Patricia and the Sochor brothers returned to the Banana Boat Lounge. Patricia had gone back inside to pay the bill before leaving. When she returned to the vehicle, she found that Delta was still unconscious and was not in any condition to drive. It was then that Dennis Sochor suggested that Patricia join him and his brother Gary for breakfast, assuring her that by the time they returned, her friend would be awake and able to drive. Patricia rejected the offer, but despite her refusal, the brothers forced her into the vehicle. The 3 of them got into Dennis Sochor's work truck, with Patricia sitting between the 2 brothers. However, instead of taking her to breakfast, Dennis drove to an isolated area where he forced her out of the vehicle and took her by force into a wooded area. According to reports, Dennis's brother, Gary Sochor, acted as an accomplice and remained inside the truck while the sexual assault was taking place, listening to Patricia's desperate screams. Later, Dennis returned to the vehicle, and both brothers went back to the house where they were living. That same day, Delta woke up inside her car, which was still parked at the Banana Boat Lounge. After realizing that Patricia was missing, She immediately reported her disappearance to the Broward County Sheriff's Office and provided information about the two brothers who had been with them during the celebration. The photograph Delta had taken that night was eventually developed, and local news outlets began reporting on the disappearance of the young woman, showing the image in which Dennis Sochor could be seen standing behind Patricia. By that time, Gary had already flown back to Michigan. Dennis, meanwhile, was staying at the house he shared with several roommates. While they were watching television, everyone saw the news report about Patricia's disappearance and how police were searching for the man seen standing behind her in the photograph. As soon as Dennis saw the report, he immediately fled the house. Police also obtained the information needed to locate Gary Sochor in Michigan. When they spoke with him, although he claimed he did not know for certain whether Patricia was dead, he described everything that had happened during New Year's Eve. Among other details, he told investigators that he had found one of Patricia's shoes and other personal belongings inside the truck. Gary agreed to return to Florida to assist with the investigation. He helped detectives reconstruct the route they had taken that night with Patricia in the vehicle and participated in the search for his brother. To escape, Dennis Sochor drove his employer's work truck to the city of Tampa, where he abandoned it. From there, he traveled by bus to New Orleans, Louisiana, and later made his way to Atlanta, Georgia. For the next 4 years, no one knew where he was. Finally, in May 1986, Dennis Sochor was arrested by police in DeKalb County, Georgia, after running a red light and driving under the influence of alcohol. After taking him into custody for those traffic violations, officers discovered that he was actually a fugitive who had been wanted for years. Following his arrest in Georgia, Florida detectives traveled to Atlanta to question Dennis Sochor. Apparently, after spending years living as a fugitive and constantly looking over his shoulder, he could no longer handle the pressure and decided to confess. During the interrogation, he gave a full confession that was recorded on audio. Sochor was later extradited back to Florida. During questioning, he confessed to the crime and told investigators that he had dumped Patricia's body in the Everglades. Despite extensive searches, her remains were never found, something that is not unusual given the vastness of the Everglades, an area inhabited by alligators and other wildlife that can make recovering a body extremely difficult. The trial took place in 1987, and the prosecution's main witness was Gary Sochor, the defendant's brother. Although the defense argued that Patricia's death could not be proven because her body had never been found, the jury heard several recorded confessions in which Dennis Sochor admitted to the crime. He was ultimately found guilty of murder and sentenced to death in November 1987. That same day, he also received a life sentence for the 1980 sexual assault, along with additional convictions for kidnapping and robbery. Nearly 39 years later, Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant, setting his execution date for July 14, 2026. On the day of his execution, Sochor woke up at 6 a.m. His only visitor was his spiritual advisor. He chose to fast, so he did not have a last meal before his execution. At 5:30 p.m., he was escorted to the execution chamber. Sochor was strapped to a gurney with an IV inserted into his arm when the curtain to the execution chamber was raised at 6 p.m. When the warden asked whether he had any final words, Sochor replied that he did and said, "To the Gifford family, I ask for your forgiveness from the bottom of my heart. I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused you. Thank you to my family for never abandoning me. I entrust my soul to Jesus Christ." Dennis Sochor was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. after receiving a 3-drug lethal injection at Florida State Prison near Stark. According to the prison spokesperson, there were no signs that he suffered during the execution. I have to wonder why Gary Sochor was never charged with Patricia Gifford's murder. Although he was present during part of the events, prosecutors determined that he did not participate in planning or carrying out the crime and that, according to his testimony, he tried to stop his brother. In addition, he cooperated with investigators from the beginning, helped reconstruct what happened, and testified during the trial. Because of this, authorities decided to use his testimony to secure Dennis Sochor's conviction rather than prosecute him. James Aaron Duckett, executed on July 28, 2026, by lethal injection.
A policeman who may have been the last person to see 11-year-old Teresa McCabe alive is under investigation himself tonight.
Teresa McCabe was a beautiful 11-year-old girl who was in the 5th grade at Mascot Elementary School. On the night of May 11, 1987, at around 10 p.m., she told her mother that she needed a pencil to finish her homework. Her mother told her she didn't want her going outside so late at night, but Teresa assured her that she would be back within 20 minutes. After insisting, her mother finally let her go. Teresa walked to a convenience store near her home and bought the pencils. A few minutes later, she left the store and ran into a 16-year-old neighbor who was at the laundromat next door. They left at nearly the same time and walked together to the store's dumpster, where they talked for about 20 minutes. That was when Officer James Duckett arrived in his patrol car. James was 29 years old and had been a police officer for only 7 months. He was the only officer on duty that night, which meant the entire town of Mascot was under his responsibility. When he saw the two young people talking, Duckett became sickeningly attracted to Teresa. He first went inside the store and asked the employee about the girl. He wanted to know her name, some personal details, and how old she was. The employee told him Teresa was between 10 and 13 years old. James said he was going to speak with her and then walked out of the store toward the dumpster. According to James's own testimony, he questioned the two children and told Teresa to go home. There was a curfew for minors at the time, meaning Teresa was not supposed to be out alone after 10:30 p.m. Then the boy's uncle arrived to pick him up and also offered to drive Teresa home. But Officer James said that wasn't necessary and told the uncle and the boy to leave. Once they were gone, he placed Teresa in the passenger seat of his patrol car, closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, started the vehicle, and drove away with her. At around 11 p.m., Teresa's mother walked to the convenience store looking for her daughter. The employee told her that Officer James had possibly taken Teresa to the police station. Teresa's mother and her sister spent the next hour driving around Mascot, but they didn't see a single patrol car. So they went to the Mascot police station looking for the officer, but no one was there. They then went to the nearest police station, which was in Groveland, and reported Teresa missing. Afterward, Teresa's mother returned to the Mascot police station and waited. Between 15 and 20 minutes passed before James finally showed up. When he did, he told her that he had spoken with Teresa at the store and that she had been sitting in his patrol car talking with him, but that she had later left on foot and headed home alone. Unbeknownst to her, Teresa's mother had just filed a missing person report with the very man who had murdered her daughter. After taking the report, James drove to Teresa's home to get a photograph of her. At first, it appeared that he was taking the initiative and trying to help move the search forward. He even called the police chief to tell him that he had already prepared a missing person flyer to distribute throughout the town. But this is where things slowly began to raise suspicions about the officer. James took the flyer to the convenience store, but only to tell the employee not to put it up, claiming that it wasn't a good photograph. He said he would come back with a better one, but he never did. There was another troubling detail. James's police radio traffic that night showed that between 10:50 p.m. and 12:10 a.m., there were no transmissions at all. More than an hour of complete silence during the exact window when Teresa disappeared. But things were about to get even worse. An employee at another store later testified that police officers normally passed by every 45 minutes to an hour. James had driven by around 9:30 p.m., but never came back. He was supposed to be patrolling, but he wasn't. The next morning, a fisherman made a horrifying discovery in Night Lake, less than a mile from the convenience store. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at, but after alerting authorities, the new officer on duty quickly confirmed it. It was Teresa. The search was over. That night, James had taken her against her will to the area around Night Lake. He parked the patrol car, forcibly removed her from the vehicle, pinned her against it, and sexually assaulted her while she was still alive. He then strangled her, and once she was unconscious, threw her body into the lake. The investigation immediately focused on James. He had been the last person seen with Teresa. He was the only patrol officer on duty that night, and the circumstantial evidence against him continued to pile up. A technician from the sheriff's department examined tire tracks found at the crime scene near Night Lake and noticed that they were highly unusual. As he was leaving the scene, he observed that the tracks appeared to match those left by a mascot police vehicle. An expert who later testified at trial confirmed the match. The tires were Goodyear Eagle mud and snow tires, designed for driving in northern climates and uncommon in Florida. Over the previous 9 years, the local tire center had accidentally received only 2 sets of that particular model, and both sets had been installed on the 2 vehicles belonging to the Mascot Police Department. Then there were the fingerprints. Both James's and Teresa's fingerprints were found on the hood of his patrol car. Teresa's fingerprints indicated that she had been sitting backward on the hood and had slid upward across the vehicle. But James continued to deny it. Meanwhile, blood and all kinds of bodily fluids from both Teresa and James were found on the girl's underwear. One key piece of evidence was a single pubic hair found inside Teresa's underwear. Investigators concluded that there was a high degree of probability that the hair belonged to James. Nearly 7 months passed before James was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was suspended from the police force on June 16, 1987, and fired 3 days later. During the trial on May 10, 1988, the jury found James guilty of sexual assault and first-degree murder. In an 8-4 vote, they recommended the death penalty. Circuit Judge Jerry Lockett sentenced James to death in the electric chair for the murder and to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the sexual assault. But this was not the only murder he was suspected of. In May 1986, an unidentified woman was found dead in a well near Lakeland after being seen getting into a dark blue car, similar to the blue Buick Regal James owned at the time. Then in September 1987, 4 months after Teresa disappeared, 14-year-old Jennifer Weldon vanished after leaving a carnival. Her body was found 2 weeks later in a rural area that James regularly passed through because of his job at a phosphate mine. At this point in the story, I forgot to mention that James was living a double life. He had a wife and children, and some of the gas receipts that placed him near the scene of Jennifer's murder were actually found by his wife. On the day of the crime, James arrived late and disheveled at work, and his wife later told investigators that he had brought home a green bag and a stuffed animal similar to those belonging to Jennifer. In 2003, authorities were planning to charge James in connection with Jennifer's murder if his conviction was overturned. However, that never happened, and he was ultimately never charged in the case. During his 38 years on death row, James filed one appeal after another, but every one of them was denied. The courts consistently ruled that even if the pubic hair evidence was questionable, the tire tracks, fingerprints, radio silence, and witness testimony all pointed to one person. On February 27, 2026, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed James's death warrant, making it the 5th execution warrant he had signed that year. His execution was originally scheduled for March, but was postponed due to the controversy surrounding the DNA evidence. James requested DNA testing on the pubic hair found at the crime scene. However, he had been offered the opportunity to have the same test performed back in 2004, and he had refused. Ultimately, the new DNA test produced inconclusive results. It did not prove that the hair belonged to James, but it also failed to establish his innocence. After further appeals, his execution was finally rescheduled for July 28, 2026. James Duckett, 68, woke up at 4:45 a.m. on July 28, 2026. At 6 a.m., he was served his last meal. Duckett did not choose it himself. Instead, he was given the prison's regular menu: eggs, grits, bacon, biscuits, and chocolate milk. Later, Duckett received a visit from a spiritual advisor whom he spoke with for some time. Finally, at noon, he was taken to a holding cell. At 12:30 p.m., he was escorted to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison in Stark, where he was strapped to a gurney and executed by lethal injection. Before the execution began, the executioner gave Duckett an opportunity to make a final statement, but he declined and remained silent until the end. Dominic Anthony Accocone, Jr., executed on July 28, 2026, by lethal injection. Dominic Anthony Accocone was born in 1945, the same year World War II came to an end. But it wasn't until he was 40 years old that he committed the crime that would ultimately send him to death row decades later. His story is one of rejection, jealousy, and obsession. Accocone could not accept that a woman had chosen to end their relationship. Instead of moving on, he made a decision that would forever change the lives of several people. And there is one especially disturbing detail. The woman who rejected him would not be the one who ultimately lost her life. Anita Garrity was born in 1952, and when she was 33 years old, she began a relationship with Accocone. The two eventually became engaged. However, Anita's parents, Raymond and Martha Artzner, never approved of the relationship. In September 1985, Anita called off the engagement, ended the relationship, and moved back into her parents' home. But Accocone refused to accept the breakup. After the relationship ended, his behavior became increasingly unstable. He began stalking and harassing Anita relentlessly. He sent flower arrangements to her workplace in an attempt to win her back, but he also showed up unannounced at her parents' house, sometimes in the middle of the night. There, he repeatedly banged on the sliding glass door outside Anita's bedroom. Anita later said that on some occasions he pounded on the door 20 times or more before finally giving up and leaving when she refused to let him inside. The situation reached a breaking point during the early morning hours of Tuesday, June 10, 1986. Anita woke up after once again hearing loud knocks on the sliding glass door outside her bedroom. Her entire family was home that night, including her 2 daughters. It was Dominic Accocone. Anita refused to let him in and shouted from inside that she was calling the police. Accocone eventually left, but about an hour later he returned. This time he was carrying a firearm. By then, everyone was still inside the house except one of Anita's daughters, who had already left for school. Accocone once again began yelling and pounding on the doors and windows. When no one allowed him inside, he went outside and cut the home's telephone lines. Moments later, Raymond Artzner, Anita's father, stepped outside armed only with a broom handle. He confronted Accocone, striking him with the handle while demanding that he leave the property. Accocone responded by opening fire. Realizing what was happening, Anita grabbed one of her daughters and escaped through another door. Both of them made it out unharmed and ran to a neighbor's house where Anita called 911. Unaware that Anita had escaped, Accocone forced his way into the home through another entrance. Once inside, he shot Martha Artzner, Anita's mother, 4 times, killing her. Accocone then fled the scene. Meanwhile, a deputy with the Pasco County Sheriff's Office found Raymond Artzner still alive, but dying outside the home with a gunshot wound to the chest. Before he died, Raymond identified Dominic Accocone as the man who had shot him. Police then deployed a bloodhound tracking dog, which followed Accocone's scent to nearby railroad tracks. There, officers located and arrested him. The case went to trial in 1987. After hearing the evidence, the jury voted 7-5 in favor of recommending the death penalty for the murder of Martha Artzner. Accocone was also sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Raymond Artzner. But that was not the end of the story. Dominic Anthony Accocone Jr. spent nearly 40 years on death row while his attorneys filed appeal after appeal in an effort to stop his execution. Every one of those appeals was denied. Finally, on June 26, 2026, the governor of Florida signed Accocone's death warrant, scheduling his execution for July 28, 2026. On the morning of his execution, he woke up at around 5 a.m., took a shower, and spent the early hours without receiving any visits from family or friends. At approximately 10 a.m., he met with his spiritual advisor. Around 1 p.m., he was served his final meal: eggplant parmesan, salad, cornbread, and a soft drink. At 6 p.m., the execution began at Florida State Prison. Accocone was strapped to a gurney as the execution team inserted an intravenous line. Throughout the procedure, his spiritual advisor remained at his side, holding a rosary and quietly moving it from one hand to the other while praying with him. When the warden asked whether he wished to make a final statement, Accocone said, "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused my family. I know that doesn't mean much, but I am sorry. I never meant to do what I did. Thank you to my sisters, who stood by me despite everything I did." After his statement, the execution team administered Florida's 3-drug lethal injection protocol. Minutes later, Dominic Anthony Accocone Jr. was pronounced dead. The execution was witnessed by 16 people, including 5 members of the media and 6 officials and communications staff members from the Florida Department of Corrections. Accocone's execution marked a historic moment. It was the second execution carried out in Florida on the same day, following the execution of James Aaron Duckett, making it the state's first double execution in more than 6 decades. At 80 years old, Accocone also became the oldest inmate executed in Florida's modern era. The following inmates were executed in late June and therefore deserve to be included in this video as well. Dusty Ray Spencer, executed on June 25, 2026, by lethal injection. In 1985, Dusty Spencer had founded a house painting business. It was one of those jobs that would change his life forever. He was hired to paint the home of Karen Spencer, and that is where they met. But just 3 years after their wedding, the marriage was already on the verge of collapse. In December 1991, Karen decided to file for divorce. Dusty's reaction was violent. He physically assaulted her and was later arrested for domestic violence. While he was in jail, Dusty issued a chilling threat. He told her that once he regained his freedom, he would kill her. Even so, Karen appeared to remain trapped in a deeply toxic relationship. Perhaps out of fear, emotional manipulation, or because she still had feelings for him, she even went as far as asking the court to release Dusty so they could spend the holiday season together. Eventually, Dusty was released before the holidays. After the celebrations on January 4, 1992, a verbal argument between the couple spiraled completely out of control. In the middle of the dispute, Dusty grabbed an iron and brutally struck Karen in the head. The attack was so violent that her teenage son, Timothy, had to step in to prevent him from killing her. Karen was rushed to the hospital, where she received 11 stitches in her face. After the attack, Dusty fled the home. At that time, domestic violence response protocols were much more limited. Despite the brutal assault and prior death threats, authorities failed to arrest Dusty or put effective protective measures in place for Karen. 2 weeks later, on January 18, 1992, the inevitable happened. Dusty returned to Karen's home with a single goal: to kill her. When he arrived, he realized no one had noticed his presence and that Karen was in the backyard with her teenage son, Timothy, and the family dog. Without saying a single word, Dusty picked up a brick and violently struck Karen in the head, knocking her to the ground instantly. What happened next is one of the most heartbreaking parts of this story. Seeing the attack, Timothy immediately reacted. He grabbed a rifle and fired at Dusty, but missed. He attempted a second shot, but the weapon jammed at the worst possible moment. At the same time, the family's small dog rushed at Dusty to defend Karen. However, he kicked it with such force that it broke several ribs. Taking advantage of the fact that no one could stop him, he pulled out a knife he was carrying and stabbed Karen repeatedly until he killed her. After the brutal attack, he quickly fled the scene, leaving Timothy completely helpless after witnessing the murder of his own mother. When police finally arrived at the scene, Karen was already dead. A heartbreaking image was recorded in the police reports. The family's small dog was lying on Karen's blood-soaked chest, whimpering and refusing to leave her side as if still trying to protect her. A few meters away was Timothy. The teenager was collapsed on the ground, crying uncontrollably, still holding the rifle in his hands. He had done everything he could to save his mother, but within seconds he had watched her die right before his eyes. Dusty was captured 2 days later in Polk County while hiding from police. The Spencer case became a catalyst for the state of Florida to drastically strengthen its domestic violence laws. The requirement that an officer must personally witness abuse in order to make an arrest was eliminated, allowing arrests to be made based on evidence collected at the scene. The laws also established that police must prioritize the victim's safety over their willingness to press charges, preventing abusers from being quickly released due to pressure or manipulation from the offender. Karen was a brilliant woman, a successful professional, and a devoted mother of 3. After her death, her remains were taken to her home state of North Carolina, where her family made the symbolic decision to remove the Spencer surname from her tombstone. Due to the brutality of the crime, in 1992, Dusty Ray Spencer was found guilty and sentenced to death. However, as is common in most cases of this kind, the legal process stretched on for decades through appeals, reviews, and other legal challenges. As a result, Spencer spent 34 years on death row waiting for the day of his execution. Finally, last month, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the order setting his execution for June 25, 2026, the date on which the sentence was ultimately carried out by lethal injection. Spencer woke up today at 5:30 a.m. and remained cooperative throughout the entire pre-execution process. At 10 o'clock, he received his only visit, a spiritual advisor who stayed with him during his final hours. At 12 noon, he was offered his last meal before death. For his final request, he chose pizza, fries, and a milkshake. Finally, at 5 p.m., Spencer was taken to the execution chamber where he was strapped down and prepared for lethal injection. Once the intravenous line was secured, the spiritual advisor entered and stood by his side during his final moments. Before the execution, he was asked if he had any last words. Spencer replied that he did and stated, "I am very sorry to the family. Into your hands I commit my spirit and my soul. I am on my way, Lord. I am on my way. Amen." Dusty was pronounced dead at 6:10 p.m. after receiving the lethal injection. According to the prison spokesperson, the procedure was carried out without complications. The victim's family did not release any public statement following the execution. Andrew Richard Lukart, executed on June 2, 2026, by lethal injection.
Reaction to the sentence today.
Ha.
What does that mean?
I'll be back.
This case is one of the saddest and most disturbing crimes ever committed in the state of Florida. To understand how this brutal crime happened, we must first learn about the man who committed it. His name was Andrew Richard Lukart. He was born in 1973 in Pennsylvania. Although this in no way excuses his actions, court records indicate that he had an extremely difficult childhood. According to those documents, he grew up in a deeply dysfunctional family environment and was subjected to physical and sexual abuse by a maternal uncle from a very young age. In the early 1990s, due to the trauma and emotional problems he carried with him, a mental health clinic formally recommended that he receive specialized treatment at the Maine Youth Center. He remained there for a period of time while dealing with various psychiatric disorders and mental health issues. After leaving the institution, Lukart began working in the construction industry. Over the years, he found employment as a laborer and warehouse worker in the city of Jacksonville, Florida, and decided to move there to start a new chapter in his life. Approximately 2 years before the crime that would ultimately send him to death row, Andrew Lukart began a romantic relationship with a woman and moved in with her. Also living in the home was Jillian French, his girlfriend's 8-month-old daughter. The relationship was marked by constant arguments and conflict. However, the situation reached an unimaginable level of violence when, during one of these episodes, Lukart brutally assaulted little Jillian. The attack caused devastating injuries, including multiple fractured ribs, retinal hemorrhaging in both eyes, and a severe traumatic brain injury that nearly cost her life. What happened next is difficult to believe. Lukart pleaded guilty to the assault and admitted responsibility for his actions. However, despite the extreme severity of the baby's injuries, the court did not impose a lengthy prison sentence. Instead, he was granted probation, a decision that would later be heavily criticized, especially after the crime that would eventually lead to his death sentence. In 1996, Andrew began a new romantic relationship with a woman named Misty Rue. Misty was the mother of 2 young daughters, Ashley, who was 2 years old, and Gabrielle Hanshaw, a baby girl who was only 5 months old. Misty was completely unaware of Lukart's violent past. Not knowing that he had previously been convicted of brutally assaulting another infant, she allowed him to move into her home in Jacksonville, Florida. Misty's father and uncle also lived in the house. Everyone in the family trusted him. Up to that point, Lukart had appeared kind and affectionate toward both girls, and no one had observed any aggressive behavior that might have hinted at what was about to happen. On the afternoon of February 25, 1996, at around 5 o'clock, Misty and Lukart returned home after running several errands around the city. Shortly afterward, Misty took Ashley into a bedroom for a nap. While she was trying to put the little girl to sleep, Lukart was left alone with baby Gabrielle in another part of the house. For several minutes, everything seemed normal. From the bedroom, Misty could hear her baby laughing as Lukart played with her and spoke to her affectionately. However, that apparent calm was about to come to an end. Suddenly, Lukart entered the room where Misty was and grabbed a diaper, visibly irritated. He told her that Gabrielle needed to be changed and then returned to the baby. Moments later, he attempted to change her diaper on the floor of one of the rooms. According to his later statement, he became frustrated because the baby kept moving around and would not stay still. What happened next was an act of violence as sudden as it was incomprehensible. In a fit of rage, Lukart brutally attacked the infant. The injuries Gabrielle suffered were devastating and would ultimately cause her death a short time later. The brutality of the crime is difficult to comprehend. Just minutes earlier, Lukart had been playing with the little girl, laughing with her, and showing her affection. Yet, according to his own account, he lost control while trying to change her diaper and ended up taking the life of a baby who was only 5 months old. Meanwhile, Misty finally managed to get Ashley to fall asleep. Shortly afterward, she heard the sound of a car engine starting outside the house. Looking out the window, she saw that it was her own vehicle and that Andrew Lukart was driving away without saying a single word. Confused by his sudden departure, Misty went to the room where he had been caring for Gabrielle. When she entered, she discovered that the baby was no longer there. Approximately 30 minutes later, she received a phone call from Lukart from a convenience store. During the conversation, he claimed that an unknown man had broken into the house, kidnapped baby Gabrielle, and fled in a pickup truck. He also said that he had tried to chase the alleged kidnapper but had been unable to catch him. Before hanging up, he told Misty to call the police immediately. After that, he ended the call and never returned to the house. Authorities immediately launched an extensive search throughout the Jacksonville area in an effort to locate the missing infant. However, from the very beginning of the investigation, detectives began to doubt Lukart's story, and he was soon considered a person of interest in the case. Hours later, in an unexpected turn of events, Lukart was found walking across property owned by a Florida Highway Patrol officer. Seeing him acting suspiciously, the trooper left his home, detained him, and notified the authorities involved in the search. At the same time, investigators located Misty's abandoned vehicle in a roadside ditch, apparently after it had been involved in a crash. The car was empty. As search teams combed through nearby woods and surrounding areas in a desperate attempt to find Gabrielle, detectives tried to question Lukart about the alleged kidnapping. However, he refused to answer any questions and requested an attorney. Even so, while he was handcuffed beside a patrol car, several officers reported hearing him quietly mutter a statement that immediately caught their attention. "I wish she hadn't messed her diaper." At that point, investigators still did not know exactly what had happened to Gabrielle, but that statement appeared to completely contradict the kidnapping story and further increased their suspicions about Lukart. Lukart agreed to speak with a detective and repeated the exact same story he had told Misty. An unknown man had entered the house, kidnapped Gabrielle, and he had unsuccessfully tried to chase him down. The detectives did not believe any of his stories. During the interrogation, they placed a photograph of Gabrielle in front of him. Lukart reacted with visible irritation, pushed the picture away, and said that he did not want to look at it. Eventually, the pressure from investigators caused him to break down. He admitted that the kidnapping story was completely false and confessed to causing the baby's death. Even then, however, he attempted to minimize what had happened. He claimed that he was changing Gabrielle's diaper while holding her in his arms when she suddenly moved, causing him to accidentally drop her and strike her head on the floor. He later led investigators to the location where Gabrielle's body was recovered. The baby was still wearing the same soiled diaper that had triggered Lukart's anger.
He's an evil, twisted-minded, sadistic person. He's an animal, and I don't think they can do to him can be compared to what he's done to my grandchild.
Do you want the death penalty for Andrew Lukart?
Yes,
Why is that?
he killed my baby.
Anything you'd like to say about this verdict? What about the next phase? Are you worried about getting the death penalty?
Nope.
Andrew Lukart was formally charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. During the trial, the medical examiner completely discredited his version of events. According to the testimony presented to the jury, the injuries suffered by Gabrielle were inconsistent with a simple accidental fall. Prosecutors also introduced as an aggravating factor his prior conviction for severe child abuse in 1994. Ultimately, on April 4, 1997, the jury found him guilty, and Andrew Richard Lukart was sentenced to death. After being sentenced to death, Andrew Lukart spent nearly 29 years on Florida's death row. During that time, he filed numerous appeals in both state and federal courts in an effort to avoid execution. His defense team argued, among other things, that the death sentence should be overturned because the jury that recommended capital punishment had not reached a unanimous verdict, an issue that years later would become the subject of significant legal debate within Florida's judicial system. His attorneys also argued that Lukart had repeatedly expressed remorse for Gabrielle's murder, and that this factor should be taken into consideration when evaluating his sentence. However, none of these appeals succeeded in changing the outcome of the case. For nearly 3 decades, courts reviewed the various motions and appeals filed by the defense time and time again, but ultimately upheld both the murder conviction and the death sentence. Finally, in May 2026, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Andrew Lukart's death warrant, setting his execution date for June 2nd of that same year. Earlier today, Lukart woke up at 7 a.m., took a shower, and remained calm throughout the morning. He declined the option of requesting a special last meal and was instead served the standard prison menu. He also received no visitors before his execution, although he did meet with a spiritual advisor several hours beforehand. At 5 p.m., he was moved to an isolation cell. According to reports, he was initially uncooperative with prison staff and had to be lightly sedated. Later, at 6 p.m., he was escorted to the execution chamber. He was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m. after receiving a lethal injection consisting of 3 drugs. According to witnesses, the execution proceeded without any complications, and there were no visible signs of suffering on the part of Andrew Lukart. He was 53 years old at the time of his death. When the warden asked Lukart if he had a final statement, he raised his head and looked toward a group seated in the front row of the witness room. There, among those watching, were members of Gabrielle's family. He then simply said, "I'm sorry." And that was the execution carried out.